My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother Elaine leaned forward smirking. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our 4-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom painted pale blue. At my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and poured every ounce of my energy into building a career in tech logistics so they could never control me. I thought cutting off their credit cards would be the end of it. I thought I had finally established a boundary that my father Harrison, a powerful city councilman and community leader, could not cross. I was completely wrong. They did not just want to hurt my feelings. They wanted to destroy my life. It started on a Tuesday morning right in the middle of the most important presentation of my career. I was the director of global logistics for a major tech firm, earning $165,000 a year. I stood at the head of the polished mahogany conference table in a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor. The CEO and 12 senior executives were listening intently as I outlined our new international supply chain software. I felt confident. I felt unstoppable. Then the heavy wooden doors swung open. 2 men in dark suits from corporate security walked in, followed closely by Brenda, the director of human resources. The room fell dead silent. The hum of the projector was the only sound as Brenda marched straight up to the podium. She did not even look me in the eye. Charmaine, I need you to step away from the screen, Brenda said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. You need to come with us immediately. I forced a polite laugh, thinking this was some sort of bizarre misunderstanding or emergency drill. Brenda, we are in the middle of the quarterly review. Can this wait 20 minutes? No, Brenda replied flatly. It cannot. Gather your personal belongings. You are being escorted off the premises. The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, refusing to make eye contact with me. My face burned hot with a mixture of confusion and profound embarrassment. I closed my laptop with trembling hands and followed Brenda out of the boardroom. The security guards walked mere inches behind me, treating me like a violent threat. We marched past rows of cubicles where my colleagues, the people I had mentored and worked alongside for 3 years, stopped typing and stared. Whispers broke out like a sudden rainstorm. When we reached Brenda's office, the security guard stood by the closed door. Brenda sat behind her desk and folded her hands. I am going to keep this brief, Charmaine, Brenda said. Your routine annual background check came back flagged this morning. We have a strict zero-tolerance policy for corporate officers with criminal records. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. I stared at her blankly. Criminal record, Brenda. I have never even had a speeding ticket. There must be a glitch in the software. Run it again. She slid a manila folder across the desk. It is a federal felony conviction for wire fraud, Charmaine. The background check agency verified your social security number and your date of birth. We cannot employ a convicted felon in a department that handles international financial logistics. Your badge has been deactivated. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address. Now security will walk you to your car. I tried to argue. I begged her to let me call my lawyer. I told her someone must have stolen my identity, but the corporate machine had already chewed me up and spit me out. Brenda simply looked away. The walk to the parking garage was the longest walk of my life. My chest felt tight and I could barely breathe. I had worked my entire adult life to build an impeccable reputation. I had clawed my way to a six-figure salary to prove to my family that I did not need their money or their conditional love. And in 5 minutes, it was entirely gone. I reached my silver Honda Accord and leaned against the door, gasping for air. I pulled out my phone to call the police to report identity theft. Before I could dial, the screen lit up with a text message. It was from my father, Harrison. I stared at the words glowing on the screen, and my blood ran ice cold. The text read, "I warned you about disrespecting this family at brunch. You think you can cut off our credit cards and sell the cabin. Think again. Sign over your grandfather's commercial lot to your sister Chloe, or the criminal record stays. I have friends in very high places, Charmaine. Do not test me." A wave of pure nausea washed over me. This was not a glitch. This was a targeted assassination. My father was a prominent city councilman. He shook hands with mayors, judges, and police chiefs. He built his entire public image around community uplift and family values. But behind closed doors, he was a ruthless dictator who punished anyone who defied him. My sister Chloe was his golden child. She had spent the last 5 years bouncing from one failed business venture to another, funded entirely by my parents and apparently my credit cards. Now they wanted the commercial real estate lot that my grandfather had left solely to me. I gripped the steering wheel of my car, screaming in frustration. They had somehow used my father's political connections to hack a federal database or falsify a background check. They framed me for a felony just to blackmail me out of an inheritance. I refused to surrender. I replied to his text with 2 words, "Nice try." I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. I needed to get home, regroup, and call my lawyer. I drove across town to my luxury apartment complex, my mind racing with legal strategies. I was going to sue my father for defamation. I was going to expose his corruption to the local news. I felt a surge of defiant adrenaline, but my father was always 3 steps ahead. When I reached the 12th floor of my building, I found my apartment door standing wide open. 2 men in work uniforms were carrying my custom velvet sofa out into the hallway. My stomach dropped. "Hey!" I shouted, running down the carpeted hall. "What are you doing? Put that down." The property manager, Mr. Davis, stepped out of my apartment holding a clipboard. He looked nervous but resolute. He blocked the doorway with his body. "Charmaine, you need to leave," Mr. Davis said, refusing to look me in the eye. "Leave," I snapped. "I pay $4,000 a month for this unit. My rent is paid through the end of the year." Mr. Davis sighed and handed me a piece of paper. It was a formal eviction notice printed on legal letterhead. "There is a morality clause in your lease agreement, Charmaine. We were notified an hour ago that you have a federal felony conviction for fraud. We cannot have convicted felons residing in a premium community. Your belongings are being moved to a storage unit downtown. Here is the key to the padlock." I snatched the paper from his hand. "Notified by who? Who called you, Mr. Davis? Was it Councilman Harrison? Did my father call you?" Mr. Davis shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I serve on the city planning board, Charmaine. Councilman Harrison is the chairman. He simply brought a matter of public safety to my attention. I am sorry, but you have to vacate the premises immediately, or I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I stood frozen in the hallway as the movers carried boxes of my clothes, my books, and my life out the door. The sheer scale of my father's power finally dawned on me. He had not just cost me my job. He had weaponized his political influence to render me completely homeless in the span of 3 hours. He wanted me broken. He wanted me desperate enough to crawl back on my hands and knees and sign over a piece of property that rightfully belonged to me. I grabbed the small duffel bag of clothes the movers had left by the door. I did not cry. I refused to shed a single tear for a family that viewed my existence as a bargaining chip. I walked back down to the parking garage and got into my Honda Accord. As the sun set over the city, casting long, dark shadows across the dashboard, I realized how truly isolated I was. My bank accounts were frozen pending a fraud investigation my employer had likely initiated. My apartment was gone. My pristine reputation was destroyed. I reclined the driver's seat of my car and pulled my winter coat over my shoulders. The nights in Connecticut were brutally cold, but the fire burning in my chest kept me warm. I looked at the text message from my father one last time before powering off my phone. He thought a few nights sleeping in a car would break my spirit. He thought his political connections made him an untouchable god. But he forgot one very important detail. He forgot that my grandfather had raised me to be a fighter. I was not going to sign over that commercial lot. I was going to figure out how they manipulated the federal database, and I was going to tear their pristine public image down to the studs. The war had just begun. 4 months passed. 122 days of waking up with ice clinging to the inside of my windshield. The bitter Connecticut winter was unforgiving, and my silver Honda Accord offered very little protection against the freezing temperatures. I learned quickly that being homeless was a full-time job. I had to map out safe parking lots where the police would not tap on my window at 2 in the morning. I had to figure out which 24-hour gyms would let me shower for the cheapest monthly membership. I rationed peanut butter sandwiches and instant coffee, carefully guarding the small amount of cash I had managed to pull from an emergency fund before my father had my main accounts frozen. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the psychological torture my family was inflicting on me. I was a software developer. I knew how systems worked. I knew that I could rebuild my life if I just had a steady income. So I swallowed my pride. I put away my tailored suits and my polished resume. I walked into warehouses, grocery stores, and delivery companies, applying for entry-level positions that paid a fraction of what I used to make. The pattern was always the exact same. I would walk in, ace the interview, and get hired on the spot. Managers loved me. They saw a well-spoken, highly organized woman who was eager to work triple shifts. I would put on my uniform, work tirelessly for 3 days, and start to feel a glimmer of hope. Then the 72-hour mark would hit. The corporate background check would clear processing, and the heavy hand of my father's influence would crush my throat all over again. It happened at a logistics warehouse. It happened at a big box retail store. It happened at a local delivery service. I would be called into a cramped back office where a manager who had been smiling at me yesterday now looked at me with a mixture of fear and disgust. They would slide a termination paper across the desk and ask me to leave the property immediately. No explanations. No chance to defend myself, just the same robotic line about company policy regarding criminal records. By the 4th month, my spirit was wearing dangerously thin. My clothes hung loosely on my frame. Dark circles carved themselves under my eyes. I was running out of cash, running out of gas, and running out of options. That was when I found a job at a family-owned diner on the outskirts of town. The manager was an older man named Marcus. He had kind eyes and hands roughened by decades of working the grill. He did not ask for a polished resume. He just needed someone who could memorize orders and handle the breakfast rush. I threw myself into the work. For 3 glorious days, I carried heavy trays of pancakes and endless pots of coffee. I smiled at the regulars. I scrubbed the counters until they shined. For the first time in months, I felt useful. I felt invisible to my father's radar. But on the afternoon of my 4th day, Marcus walked out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He did not look at me. He just nodded toward his tiny back office. My stomach instantly tied itself into a knot. I knew the walk to that office all too well. I sat down in the folding chair across from his cluttered desk. Marcus let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his temples. "Charmaine," he started, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "You are the best waitress I have hired in 5 years. You are fast, you are polite, and the customers already love you. But I use a third-party payroll service to handle my taxes and insurance. They ran your mandatory background check this morning." I gripped the edge of his desk, my knuckles turning white. "Marcus, please. Whatever it says, it is a lie. Someone stole my identity. I am fighting it legally, but I just need a chance to work. I need this job to survive." Marcus turned his computer monitor around so I could see the screen. "I cannot afford the liability insurance, Charmaine. The system flagged your social security number. It says right here you are a convicted felon. Wire fraud. Federal level. My insurance provider will drop my diner if I keep you on the payroll. I am so sorry." I leaned forward, staring at the glowing screen. For the first time, I was actually looking at the raw data. instead of just hearing a corporate HR director summarize it. I scanned the lines of text. Name Charmaine. Date of birth correct. Social security number correct. But then I looked closer at the specific court filing attached to the record. The name on the actual court document was not mine. It was a woman named Charmaine Washington, a known fraudster who had been convicted in a different state 5 years ago. My mind started racing, processing the data like the software engineer I was. This was not a simple clerical error. The background check system uses automated algorithms. If someone with high-level administrative access went into the Fair Credit Reporting Act database, they could manually link my social security number to this other woman's criminal file. Every time an employer ran my social, the system would automatically pull her felony and slap it onto my clean record. But you cannot just log into a federal database from a home computer. You need enterprise-level clearance. You need to be a verified corporate officer with a registered banking or human resources institution. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. DeAndre, my sister Chloe's husband, my arrogant, insufferable brother-in-law. DeAndre was the vice president of human resources at a major regional bank. He spent family dinners bragging about his security clearances and how he had the power to make or break careers with a single keystroke. He had direct access to the exact databases that fed into these third-party background check companies. My father was the mastermind using his political weight to set the trap, but DeAndre was the executioner. He was the one who had weaponized his corporate access to build this invisible cage around me. They had coordinated this perfectly. They knew that without income, I could not afford to hire an attorney to untangle the digital mess they had created. They wanted to starve me out. Marcus handed me an envelope with my cash pay for the 3 days I had worked. I took it, thanked him for his kindness, and walked out into the freezing parking lot. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, my breath fogging up the cold windows. I was not just fighting my father's political connections anymore. I was fighting a coordinated cyber attack from my own family. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was a cheap prepaid burner phone I had bought after cutting off my main line to stop my mother's relentless harassing texts. Only 3 people had this new number: my lawyer, my former landlord, and somehow my sister Chloe. As if on cue, the screen lit up with a notification. It was a new voicemail, but it was not from Chloe. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the smooth, condescending voice of my brother-in-law. "Hey there," Charmaine DeAndre said, chuckling softly into the receiver. "Word on the street is you just lost another gig. You know it is crazy how hard the job market is these days, especially for people with a troubled past." I squeezed my eyes shut, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. "Look!" DeAndre continued, his tone shifting from mocking to sharp and commanding. "Chloe is tired of waiting. She needs that commercial land to build her luxury salon and spa. Your father is losing his patience. Stop being stubborn. Stop freezing in your car like a stray dog. You are embarrassing the family name. Sign the deed over to Chloe by the end of the week. It just takes one click on my end to make you employable again. Be smart about this, bro." The line went dead. I lowered the phone to my lap. The sheer audacity of his message vibrated through my veins. He had just confessed. He was so arrogant, so confident in his power, that he had actually left a voice record of his blackmail. He thought I was utterly powerless. He thought I was just a broken woman sleeping in a Honda. They had severely miscalculated. They thought they were starving me into submission, but all they had really done was strip away everything I had left to lose. I had no job to protect. I had no apartment to maintain. I had no reputation left to salvage. I was completely free to destroy them. I started the engine of my car, the heater blasting cold air against my numb fingers. I did not know exactly how I was going to prove DeAndre manipulated the federal database, but I knew I was going to make him regret the day he ever met my sister. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the diner parking lot, my mind already formulating the first steps of a digital counteroffensive. I was going to tear down their kingdom of lies brick by brick. 2 more months dragged by. Month 6 of living in my car. The brutal Connecticut winter showed no mercy, and the savings I had managed to scrape together from my brief sabotaged stints at diners and delivery companies were completely gone. I was surviving on whatever I could find, rationing stale crackers and drinking water from public restroom sinks. The physical toll was agonizing. Hunger is not just an empty feeling in your stomach. It is a loud, persistent alarm ringing in your brain, dulling your thoughts and making your limbs feel like lead. My clothes hung off my shrinking frame. My skin was pale and dry. The heater in my Honda Accord had finally given out, leaving me shivering violently through the long, dark, sub-zero nights. I was starving. I was exhausted. I was running entirely on fumes and a desperate burning anger. I could not fight a digital war against my family from a dead laptop in a freezing car. I had no money for a lawyer. I had no leverage. I realized I had to confront them directly. I had to force them to look at what they were doing to me. I needed them to undo the hack, and I knew exactly where they all were. Every Sunday at precisely 5 o'clock, my father Harrison hosted his lavish Sunday dinner at his sprawling 6-bedroom estate in Fairfield. It was a mandatory weekly performance of wealth status and false unity. I drove my sputtering car through the iron gates of my parents' upscale neighborhood. The contrast was nauseating. Massive houses wrapped in warm, elegant landscaping lights. Luxury vehicles parked in perfectly paved driveways. I parked my battered Honda down the street and walked the rest of the way. The bitter wind whipped through my thin winter coat, chilling me to the bone. I did not bother knocking. I knew the security code to the side kitchen door, a code that had remained the same since I was a teenager. The smell hit me the second I stepped into the warm hallway. Roast lamb, garlic, mashed potatoes, rich gravy, and warm buttered rolls. My stomach cramped so fiercely I had to lean against the wall, squeezing my eyes shut. The house was a temple of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over imported marble floors and expensive original artwork. I could hear the clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses and the booming sound of my father's laughter echoing from the formal dining room. I stepped quietly into the shadows of the hallway and listened. The entire extended family was there. Aunts, uncles, and cousins were gathered around the massive mahogany table. But my sister Chloe was the one holding court. She was sitting next to DeAndre, practically vibrating with arrogance. I peeked around the corner. Chloe was extending her wrist, showing off a blindingly bright diamond tennis bracelet to my mother and the rest of the captivated table. DeAndre completely surprised me. Chloe beamed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. $15,000. He said my wrist looked a little too bare for the charity gala next week. We have to maintain the family image after all. My mother cooed in admiration, reaching over to touch the diamonds. Honestly, maintaining our brand is a full-time job. Chloe continued, her tone shifting from boastful to deeply annoyed. Especially with Charmaine acting like a complete lunatic. Have you all heard? She is practically living on the streets. It is so embarrassing. Daddy works so hard to promote Black excellence in this community, and my own sister is out there looking like a vagrant. What if the press finds out? What if one of your city council rivals takes a picture of her digging through trash? She is destroying our family legacy out of pure spite just because she is jealous of my salon. I could not take it anymore. The sheer audacity of her lies broke through my exhaustion. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the formal dining room. The silence was immediate and absolute. Forks froze in midair. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. DeAndre stiffened in his chair, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second before returning. I knew exactly what I looked like. I had not showered properly in days. My hair was messy and unkempt. My face was hollowed out from starvation and my clothes were wrinkled and stained. I looked exactly like the vagrant Chloe was just describing. But I stood tall, refusing to shrink under their collective stares. I am not destroying the family legacy, Chloe, I said, my voice raspy but remarkably steady. I am just trying to survive the one you and your husband created for me. DeAndre scoffed loudly, setting his wineglass down on the table. Charmaine, you look terrible. You really should not be crashing family dinners looking like a stray animal. You are upsetting your mother. I ignored him and locked eyes with my father. Harrison was sitting at the head of the table wearing a tailored cashmere sweater, his face a mask of cold fury. He despised being interrupted, especially in front of his audience. Tell your son-in-law to undo the hack, Dad, I demanded, stepping further into the room. Tell him to go back into the Fair Credit Reporting Act database and remove the fraudulent felony from my social security number. I know what he did. I know he used his bank security clearance to frame me so you could steal my property. Undo it right now. Harrison slowly wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin. He did not look panicked. He did not look guilty. He looked utterly bored. He stood up, towering over the table, and walked slowly toward me. The entire extended family held their breath, watching the patriarch prepare to discipline his disobedient child. "You are delusional," Charmaine Harrison said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the room. "You failed in the corporate world because you lacked discipline. You made poor choices. And now you are bursting into my home, interrupting our meal, and hurling baseless, paranoid accusations at DeAndre. You sound completely unhinged. This erratic behavior is exactly why you need supervision." He stopped 2 feet in front of me, looking down at my worn-out sneakers. He reached into the pocket of his slacks and pulled out a money clip. He slowly extracted a crisp $50 bill. He did not hand it to me. He held it out and deliberately let go. The bill fluttered through the air and landed silently on the marble floor right at my feet. "Pick it up," Harrison commanded, his voice echoing in the silent dining room. "Take that money. Go buy yourself a hot meal and get a cheap hotel room for the night. Clean yourself up. Tomorrow morning you will walk into my office and bring me the deed to that commercial lot. Granddad Silas was senile when he left it to you anyway. He made a mistake. I am fixing it. Sign the land over to your sister and maybe I will convince DeAndre to see if he can help clear up whatever unfortunate glitch is on your background check." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice so only I could hear the venom in his words. "Refuse, and you can go back out there and freeze in that car until you waste away completely." I looked down at the money. $50. A pathetic, insulting sum meant to break whatever pride I had left. My stomach roared with hunger, twisting into painful knots. The smell of the roasted lamb and warm bread was intoxicating. My body was screaming at me to submit. It would be so incredibly easy to bend down, pick up the bill, and buy a massive warm meal. It would be so easy to give them the land tomorrow and just go back to my comfortable, highly paid corporate life. I could end the suffering right now. I looked up from the floor. I looked at Chloe, who was smirking at me, adjusting her $15,000 bracelet. I looked at DeAndre, who was swirling his wine with a triumphant, untouchable grin. And then I looked at my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, using my actual starvation as a business negotiation tactic. They were sitting in a 6-bedroom mansion eating a feast, draped in diamonds, funded by my misery. I did not bend down. I lifted my foot and stepped firmly on top of the $50 bill, pressing my dirty, wet shoe into the crisp paper. I locked eyes with my father, refusing to let him see the tears of exhaustion pricking the corners of my eyes. "Keep your money," I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage so deep and primal it terrified me. "And tell Chloe to enjoy the bracelet, because she is going to need something to sell when this is all over." I turned my back on all of them. I walked out of the warm, lavish dining room, down the long marble hallway, and back out the side door. The freezing Connecticut wind slammed into me the second I stepped outside. A bitter winter storm had rolled in while I was in the house. Snow was falling heavily, swirling in the wind, and coating the streets in a thick, slippery layer of ice. I wrapped my thin coat tightly around my shivering body and began the long, agonizing walk back down the street to my freezing car. The cold pierced right through to my bones. I was starving. I was completely exhausted. As I climbed into the icy driver's seat of my Honda and pulled my knees to my chest, I felt entirely defeated. The sheer weight of their power and their cruelty pressed down on me in the dark. But as the winter storm howled against my windshield, the profound humiliation of that dining room began to harden into something else. Something unbreakable. I sat in the freezing darkness of my Honda Accord, listening to the violent howling of the wind as it battered the thin metal doors. The winter storm had escalated into a full blizzard, burying the affluent streets of Fairfield under a thick, impenetrable blanket of white. The streetlights flickered against the heavy snowfall, casting long, eerie shadows across the dashboard of my car. I pulled my knees tightly against my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs in a desperate attempt to conserve whatever body heat I had left. The profound humiliation of that dining room had hardened into something unbreakable, but my physical body was rapidly reaching its breaking point. I was dangerously cold. My fingers and toes had gone completely numb, and a heavy, terrifying exhaustion was pulling at the edges of my consciousness. I leaned my head against the frozen steering wheel, my breath pluming in the icy air of the cabin. I had spent 7 months living in this vehicle. 7 months of dodging security guards, rationing stale food, and waking up with frost in my hair. Meanwhile, my father Harrison kept texting me from his warm, luxurious office demanding that I come home, apologize, and surrender my grandfather's commercial lot so he would finally stop tormenting me. He thought the bitter cold would erode my willpower. He thought hunger would force me to crawl back to him and accept my place as the family scapegoat. I closed my eyes, fighting the overwhelming urge to drift into a deep, dangerous sleep. I knew if I fell asleep in this temperature without the heater running, I might not wake up. I started doing mental math, trying to keep my brain active. I calculated the exact distance to the nearest 24-hour gas station where I could thaw out in the restroom. I calculated how many dollars I would need to buy a cup of black coffee just to justify standing inside the store. I was a software developer. My entire career was built on solving complex logical problems. But the system my father and DeAndre had built to destroy my life felt impenetrable. They had money, political power, and high-level corporate access. I had an empty gas tank and a dying phone. Suddenly, a sharp metallic tap echoed through the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. I jolted upright, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. My eyes darted to the driver's side window. Through the thick layer of ice and condensation, I saw a dark silhouette standing right outside my door. Panic flooded my veins. My first thought was that my father had sent the local police to arrest me for vagrancy. My second thought was that he had sent private security to tow my car and leave me stranded in the blizzard. I scrambled backward, pressing my spine against the passenger seat, my breathing shallow and fast. The figure did not move. A gloved hand reached out and wiped a clear circle away from the frost on the glass. I leaned forward, squinting through the small opening. It was not a police officer. It was a woman. She looked to be in her mid-50s, wearing a heavy, tailored blue wool coat that stood out vividly against the swirling white snow. A thick scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck, and her dark eyes were locked directly onto mine. She did not look angry, but she certainly did not look friendly either. Her expression was entirely unreadable, sharp and calculating. She raised her hand and pointed a single commanding finger downward, gesturing for me to roll down the window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the manual window crank. The mechanism was frozen stiff, but I threw my entire body weight into it, forcing the glass to slide down a few agonizing inches. A blast of freezing wind and snow whipped into my face, stinging my cheeks. "Are you, Charmaine?" the woman asked. Her voice was crisp, authoritative, and completely steady, despite the howling storm around her. "Yes," I stammered, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Who are you? Did my father send you? If Harrison sent you to threaten me again, tell him I am not signing the deed. You can tell him I would rather freeze out here." The woman let out a short, humorless breath that was not quite a laugh. "Councilman Harrison could not afford my daily rate, even if he liquidated his entire political campaign fund," she said flatly. She reached into the deep pocket of her blue coat and pulled out a sleek, minimalist business card. She slid it through the crack in the window. I caught it with trembling fingers. The card was made of heavy, expensive cardstock. It simply read, "Evelyn Private Investigations and Asset Recovery," followed by a secure phone number. I looked up at her entirely bewildered. "Evelyn, I do not have any money to hire a private investigator. I do not even have money to buy a hot meal. I think you have the wrong person. I am not here to be hired." "Charmaine," Evelyn said, her piercing dark eyes scanning the miserable condition of my car interior. She did not offer a single word of pity. She looked at my hollowed-out face and my stained clothes with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining an X-ray. "I was hired 5 years ago. I stared at her, the freezing wind momentarily forgotten. 5 years ago. By who? Evelyn reached down to the heavy leather tote bag resting against her snow-covered boots. She pulled out a small, incredibly heavy steel lockbox. It looked like an industrial-grade security safe, the kind used to transport precious metals or highly classified documents. She hoisted it up and shoved it firmly through the narrow opening of my window. I had to grab it with both hands to keep it from dropping onto the floorboards. The metal was freezing cold and weighed at least 10 pounds. Grandad Silas knew Harrison was a parasite, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. He saw right through your father's fake community leader routine. He knew Harrison was going to try and steal the commercial lot the second the will was read. He knew your father would use every dirty political trick in the book to break you. My breath hitched into my throat. My grandfather. Silas had been the only person in my family who ever truly saw me. He was a self-made man who had clawed his way up from nothing, purchasing commercial real estate in neighborhoods where the banks originally refused to lend to black men. He despised my father's flashy suits, his empty political speeches, and the toxic culture of conditional love my parents bred in our house. Silas had died of aggressive lung cancer right before my career in tech took off. He hired me before the cancer took him. Evelyn continued, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. He paid my retainer in full half a decade in advance with very specific instructions. He told me to keep a quiet eye on you, and if Harrison ever pushed you entirely out into the cold, I was supposed to deliver this box. I looked down at the heavy steel safe resting on my lap, my mind reeling. Grandad Silas had known. He had anticipated this exact scenario. He knew my father was capable of rendering me homeless, and he had orchestrated a safety net from beyond the grave. What is inside it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper over the wind. Everything you need, Evelyn replied. There is a key taped to the bottom of the box. Open it. Read everything carefully. And whatever you do, do not call the number on my card until you have read every single page. Do you understand me, Charmaine? You need to understand the full scope of the battlefield before we make our first move. I nodded slowly, too stunned to form a coherent sentence. Evelyn gave me one last assessing look. Stay warm, kid, she said softly. A tiny fracture of genuine empathy finally breaking through her stoic demeanor. It is about to get very hot for your family. Without another word, Evelyn turned around and walked away, her boots crunching heavily in the deep snow. I watched through the icy glass as she climbed into the back seat of a black SUV parked silently at the end of the street. The taillights flared red for a brief moment before the vehicle glided away, disappearing completely into the blinding white blizzard. I was alone again. But the heavy, freezing terror that had gripped my chest just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. I rolled the window up, sealing myself back inside the dark cabin. I turned on the small overhead dome light. It cast a weak yellow glow over my lap. I flipped the heavy steel lockbox over. Just as Evelyn had said, a small silver brass key was secured to the bottom with a strip of black industrial tape. I peeled the tape away, my fingers fumbling with cold, and inserted the key into the heavy lock. I turned it. The lock disengaged with a loud, satisfying metallic clack. I took a deep breath and pushed the heavy steel lid open. The smell of old paper and worn leather drifted up into the freezing air of the car. The box was packed tightly. I carefully reached inside and began to pull the items out, laying them gently on the passenger seat. First, there was a thick stack of manila folders. I opened the top one. It was filled with dozens of IRS tax documents and bank statements. The pages were heavily redacted with thick black marker, but the official government seals were clearly visible. I could see my father's name, Harrison, alongside the names of several shell corporations and the city charity fund he supposedly managed. Next, I pulled out a small, sleek black box. I opened it, and sitting on a bed of dark velvet was a heavy, solid metal bank card. It was entirely matte black. There was no bank logo, no expiration date, and no name printed on it. It only featured a gold EMV chip and a 16-digit account number engraved deeply into the metal. It felt heavy and cold, practically radiating financial power. Finally, resting at the very bottom of the safe was a dark brown leather journal. The leather was worn and crease softened by years of use. I recognized it immediately. It was the journal my grandfather Silas used to carry in his breast pocket everywhere he went. He used to record his property measurements, his tenant lists, and his private thoughts in this exact book. I picked up the journal, my thumbs tracing the familiar grain of the leather. My heart was beating so fiercely I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I slowly opened the heavy cover and turned to the very first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his. It was written in bold, sharp black ink, the letters slanting confidently across the yellowed paper. I stared at the words, reading them over and over again until they were permanently burned into my memory. Charmaine, if you are reading this, your father has tried to destroy you. Here is the ammunition to bury him. I closed the journal carefully. My hands were shaking not just from the bitter cold anymore, but from the sheer magnitude of what I was holding. I could not process this information in the dark, freezing cabin of my car. I needed light. I needed heat. I carefully packed the documents, the black metal card, and the journal back into the heavy steel lockbox and locked it. I shoved the key deep into my pocket, started the engine, and drove toward the bright neon sign of a 24-hour truck stop diner I had mapped out earlier that week. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in. The diner was mostly empty, smelling of stale grease and industrial floor cleaner. I slid into a vinyl booth in the far back corner, directly under a flickering fluorescent light. A tired waitress approached and I ordered a single cup of black coffee, silently praying I had enough loose change at the bottom of my bag to cover the $2.50. Once she set the steaming mug in front of me and walked away, I pulled the lockbox onto the table and opened it again. I started with the property deeds and the city zoning maps Granddad Silas had meticulously collected. For months, my father had been insisting that the commercial lot Silas left me was a worthless piece of dilapidated concrete. Harrison claimed it was barely worth $200,000 and that signing it over to Chloe was simply a matter of family convenience. I unfolded a massive, heavily annotated city planning blueprint. Silas had drawn red circles around my property lines. My eyes scanned the legend and the corresponding city council proposals attached to the back. The truth hit me like a physical blow. The lot was not worthless. It was the exact opposite. The city had secretly approved a massive multi-billion-dollar urban redevelopment project. My grandfather's lot was sitting directly in the center of the newly zoned Central Transit Hub. It was the anchor property for the entire infrastructure project. Developers could not break ground on the transit center without acquiring my land first. I looked at the official appraisal document Silas had commissioned shortly before his death. The lot was not worth $200,000. It was valued at $8.5 million. My father knew. Harrison was the chairman of the city planning board. He had access to these zoning blueprints years before they were made public. He knew exactly what that land was worth. He had orchestrated my financial ruin, weaponized DeAndre to destroy my career, and forced me into homelessness, all to blackmail me out of an $8.5 million gold mine. He wanted to steal my inheritance and hand it to Chloe so she could use the capital to fund her ridiculous luxury spa and his political campaigns. The sheer, unadulterated greed made my stomach churn. I pushed the blueprints aside and reached for the thick stack of IRS tax documents and bank statements. If my father was willing to destroy his own daughter for an $8 million property, I needed to know what else he was hiding. I opened the manila folder labeled Community Charity Fund. This was Harrison's pride and joy. It was the nonprofit organization he paraded in front of the press, claiming it provided scholarships and housing assistance to underprivileged families in our district. I am a software engineer. I spend my life analyzing complex data structures and finding anomalies. As I laid the bank statements out across the sticky diner table, the financial architecture of their crimes became glaringly obvious. The charity fund was completely bankrupt. There was no scholarship money. There was no housing assistance. Instead, I found a labyrinth of wire transfers moving massive sums of federal grant money out of the charity accounts and into a series of obscure LLCs. I cross-referenced the names of the LLC owners with the corporate registry documents Silas had provided. My heart pounded against my ribs. Every single shell company belonged to either my father or my sister Chloe. They were embezzling federal grants. DeAndre, using his position as Vice President of Human Resources at the regional bank, was the one authorizing and burying the transactions so they would not trigger automated fraud alerts. I traced a specific federal deposit of $500,000 meant for a community center renovation. Within 48 hours of hitting the charity account, the money was fractured into dozens of smaller payments. $50,000 went to a luxury car dealership in DeAndre's name. $100,000 was wired to a high-end commercial contractor for the initial build-out of Chloe's new salon. The rest was funneled directly into a political action committee that exclusively funded my father's re-election campaign. They were stealing millions of dollars from the very community my father swore to protect. This was not just unethical, it was a massive coordinated federal crime: wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, embezzlement. DeAndre had flagged my background check with a fake felony to ruin my life, while he and my father were committing actual federal felonies every single day. The hypocrisy was so staggering I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Silas had not just left me a defense, he had left me a nuclear arsenal. I carefully stacked the incriminating IRS documents back into their folder. There was only one item left in the lockbox: the sleek, matte black bank card. I picked it up. It felt heavy in my palm, cool to the touch. I opened the final letter from my grandfather, a single sheet of heavy parchment paper folded neatly beneath where the card had rested. The letter was short and direct. Charmaine. I spent my life building wealth so my family would never have to bow to anyone. I saw Harrison turning my legacy into a vehicle for his own vanity and corruption. I knew he would try to take what is yours. So I liquidated my private offshore holdings and established a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. He does not know about it. Oh. The IRS does not know about it. Only Evelyn and the trustees know. The card in your hand gives you unrestricted access to the trust. Use it to protect yourself. Use it to tear down the rotten foundation your father built. Attached to the letter was a recent printed statement from the offshore trust dated just 2 days ago. Evelyn must have slipped it into the box before handing it to me. I scanned down to the bottom line, my eyes widening in absolute disbelief. I read the number again, and then a third time. $12,400,000. I stared at the paper, the numbers blurring together as a profound, overwhelming silence washed over me. I had spent the last 7 months counting pennies, rationing peanut butter, and calculating the exact cost of a hot shower at the local gym. I had endured the bitter cold of my car and the humiliating sneers of my family at Sunday dinner. And the entire time, sitting in an offshore account waiting for me was over $12 million. I was not a helpless, homeless vagrant. I was a multimillionaire. The waitress appeared at my table looking exhausted as she wiped her hands on her apron. She placed a small paper check next to my coffee mug. $2.50, hun, she said kindly. No rush. I looked at the check. I looked at the few crumpled dollar bills sitting at the bottom of my bag. Then I looked at the heavy black metal card in my hand. I did not know if it would work in a small-town diner. I did not know if the transaction would go through. But I needed to know if this was real. I slid the black card across the table. Put it on this, please, and add a $500 tip for yourself. The waitress blinked, looking at the featureless black metal, then up at my stained clothes and hollowed-out face. She looked like she wanted to argue, assuming I was playing a cruel joke on her. But she sighed, picked up the card, and walked over to the cash register behind the counter. I held my breath. I watched her swipe the heavy metal card through the outdated machine. The machine beeped once. It processed for what felt like an eternity. Then the receipt printer sprang to life, buzzing loudly as it spit out the approved transaction slip. The waitress stared at the receipt, her jaw dropping slightly. She walked back over to my table, her hands trembling as she handed me a pen to sign the merchant copy. I calmly took a sip of my coffee. The bitter liquid tasted sweeter than anything I had ever consumed. My father thought he had buried me. He thought he had stripped me of my power, my voice, and my future. But as I sat in that dingy diner holding the financial ruin of my entire family in a steel lockbox, I realized something incredibly dangerous. They had not buried me, they had planted me. And I was about to grow into their worst nightmare. I walked out of that diner leaving the $500 tip on the table and climbed back into my freezing Honda Accord for the very last time. I did not drive back to the dark, empty parking lots where I had spent the last 7 months hiding from the police. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Hartford, pulling up to the valet stand of the most exclusive luxury hotel in the city. The valet attendant took one look at my battered, rusted car and my stained winter coat and immediately held up his hand ready to tell me the lot was for guests only. I rolled down my window, handed him the keys, and walked past him without saying a single word. The lobby was a masterpiece of polished marble and glowing chandeliers. The night manager at the front desk stiffened as I approached, his eyes darting to the security guard standing near the elevators. He plastered on a fake, strained smile. "Can I help you, Mom?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "We are fully booked tonight and the lobby is reserved for paying patrons." "I need your largest executive suite," I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I just told you we have no vacancies for walk-ins," he replied, crossing his arms. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy matte black metal card, and placed it firmly on the marble counter. "Run it for a $10,000 deposit," I instructed. "And if you tell me you are fully booked one more time, I will buy this hotel tomorrow and fire you before lunch." The manager stared at the featureless metal card. He recognized the weight of it. He recognized the tier of wealth it represented. His smug expression vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, stammering panic. He snatched the card, ran it through the terminal, and visibly flinched when the machine chirped with an immediate approval. Within 3 minutes, I was handed a gold keycard and escorted to the penthouse floor by a profusely apologizing staff member. When the heavy wooden doors of the suite clicked shut behind me, I locked the deadbolt and collapsed against the wall. I was safe. I stripped off the dirty, freezing layers of clothes that had been my prison for over half a year and threw them directly into the trash can. I walked into the massive marble bathroom, turned the brass handles of the rainfall shower, and stepped under the scalding hot water. I stood there for over an hour, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, watching the dirt and the misery of the last 7 months swirl down the silver drain. I washed away the smell of the cold car. I washed away the humiliation of my father's $50 bill. I washed away the victim they had tried to turn me into. I slept for 14 unbroken hours in a king-sized bed, piled high with down comforters. When I woke up the next morning, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The hunger was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating hunger for justice. I ordered an exorbitant amount of room service, eating hot eggs and fresh fruit while I formulated my strategy. I could not stay at a public hotel forever. My father had connections with the local police, and if he ran my name, he would find me. I needed to become completely invisible. I opened my phone and called a high-end corporate attorney in Delaware. Using the funds from the blind trust, I rapidly established an anonymous shell corporation named Silas Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Within 4 hours, the LLC had wired a full year's rent in advance to secure a secluded ultra-luxury penthouse apartment in a private high-security building across town. The lease was signed under the corporate name. There was no trace of Charmaine anywhere on the paperwork. I was entirely off the grid. Next, I needed my weapons. I went to a premium electronics store and spent $30,000 in cash. I bought a top-tier military-grade encrypted laptop, 3 high-resolution curved monitors, independent server drives, and advanced firewall software. I was a software engineer. My brain was wired for data, and my family had foolishly assumed that taking away my corporate job meant taking away my skills. They were about to learn that taking away my corporate restrictions only made me more dangerous. I arrived at my new penthouse as the sun was setting. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the city skyline. It was a fortress of glass and steel. I set up my new equipment on a massive glass dining table, booting up the encrypted network. Once the firewalls were active and my connection was fully masked behind multiple secure VPNs, I reached into my bag and pulled out the business card Evelyn had given me in the blizzard. I dialed the number. She answered on the first ring. "I have read every page," I said simply. "Good," Evelyn replied, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Give me your current address. I am bringing someone to meet you." An hour later, the private elevator in my penthouse chimed. Evelyn stepped out wearing her signature blue wool coat. She was followed by a tall, lean man in his late 40s, with sharp eyes and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He looked around the luxurious, minimalist apartment, his eyes landing on my multi-monitor setup, with a nod of professional approval. "Charmaine, this is Elias," Evelyn said, taking a seat on the leather sofa. "He is a former cyber analyst for the FBI. He specializes in corporate data breaches and federal identity theft. Your grandfather kept him on retainer for exactly this kind of situation." Elias walked over to my glass table and set his bag down. "Evelyn briefed me on the background check manipulation," he said, pulling out a modified tablet. "You are dealing with a Fair Credit Reporting Act violation. The FCRA database is heavily guarded. To permanently link your social security number to a convicted felon, someone had to bypass the automated algorithms and force a manual override." "I know," I replied, pulling up a blank terminal window on my center monitor. "My brother-in-law, DeAndre, is the vice president of human resources at a regional bank. He has enterprise-level clearance to run background checks on bank executives. I am certain he used his corporate portal to poison my file. But I need to prove it. I need the digital blood trail." Elias smirked, pulling up a chair next to me. "Then let us go hunting." For the next 6 hours, Elias and I worked in absolute synchronization. It was an intricate, highly complex digital dance. We could not just hack directly into the federal database that would alert the authorities to us. Instead, Elias used a backdoor exploit to access the query logs of the specific third-party vendor that my former corporate employer used to run my background check. We sifted through thousands of encrypted data packets, isolating the exact moment my clean record was suddenly overwritten with the felony charge. "Look at this," I said, pointing my pen at a string of code scrolling rapidly across the left monitor. The manual override did not originate from the federal system. It was pushed through an API gateway linked to a private banking institution. Elias leaned in, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he intercepted the routing data. "He is pulling the network handshake logs." "Got it," Elias muttered. The override request was authenticated using an executive security token. We traced the token backward. DeAndre was arrogant. He was so blindingly confident in his own superiority, and so entirely convinced that I was a helpless, broke woman sleeping in a car that he did not even bother to use a proxy server to mask his location. He assumed no one would ever have the financial resources or the technical expertise to audit a background check data pipeline. "There it is," Elias said, hitting the enter key with a definitive strike. The screen flashed, displaying a static IP address, a MAC address, and a precise timestamp. I stared at the numbers glowing on the screen, my blood running cold. The IP address belonged to the internal private executive network at DeAndre's bank. The MAC address belonged to his specific office computer terminal. And the timestamp was horrifyingly precise. "He executed the override at 8:15 in the morning on a Tuesday," I whispered, tracing my finger along the glowing digits. "Does that time mean something to you?" Evelyn asked from the sofa, leaning forward. I closed my eyes, the memory rushing back with sickening clarity. 8:15 in the morning was exactly 45 minutes before I stepped into that glass-walled boardroom to give my supply chain presentation. DeAndre had sat in his plush office, sipped his morning coffee, and typed the keystrokes that ruined my life right before I started my meeting. He timed it perfectly so I would be publicly humiliated and escorted out by security in front of my entire company. Elias leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What we have right here is a definitive digital fingerprint." DeAndre used a federally insured banking network to commit identity theft, falsify a government document, and violate the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Because he used a bank server, it elevates the charge to federal wire fraud. I looked at the data. I looked at the undeniable proof of his malicious coordinated attack. For months, I had only wanted them to undo the hack so I could get my life back. I only wanted to clear my name. But as I stared at the irrefutable evidence of federal crimes combined with the embezzled charity funds I had discovered in my grandfather's files, a new magnificent reality washed over me. I turned my chair to face Evelyn, my heart beating with a steady, terrifying calm. "I do not just have enough evidence to clear my name," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. "Identity theft, wire fraud, embezzling federal grants, and tax evasion." Evelyn smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that finally matched my own. "That is a heavy combination, Charmaine. What are we looking at?" I looked back at the screen. "I have enough to put my father and my brother-in-law in a federal penitentiary for 15 years. They thought they could use the system to break me. Now I am going to use the system to bury them." The next morning, Evelyn made a single phone call. We did not waste time looking for local attorneys in Connecticut who might be susceptible to my father's political influence or who might play golf with his judge friends. We needed legal predators who operated entirely outside of his jurisdiction. We needed the kind of lawyers who specialized in dismantling corrupt politicians and white-collar criminals on a federal level. We needed Washington, D.C. Using the funds from my grandfather's offshore trust, I chartered a private flight. Within hours, Evelyn, Elias, and I were sitting in the hyper-modern glass-enclosed conference room of one of the most ruthless defense firms on the East Coast. The firm was located just 3 blocks from the Department of Justice. The lead partner, a man named Donovan, walked into the room. He was a former federal prosecutor who had spent 20 years putting crooked hedge fund managers and corrupt senators behind bars. He did not smile when he introduced himself. He just sat down, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and looked at the heavy steel lockbox resting in the center of the polished mahogany table. I opened the box. I handed Donovan the heavily redacted IRS documents, the shell company registrations, and the blind trust financials. Then Elias connected his encrypted laptop to the conference room monitors and displayed the digital blood trail we had uncovered the night before. He showed Donovan the exact IP address, the executive security token, and the timestamp proving DeAndre had illegally altered my background check from his bank office. Donovan adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the documents and the glowing screens with the terrifying speed of a seasoned predator. The room was completely silent for 10 minutes. The only sound was the rustling of paper and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Donovan set the files down, laced his fingers together, and looked directly at me. "Councilman Harrison and your brother-in-law have been incredibly sloppy," Donovan said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "They are operating under the delusion that local political power makes them immune to federal oversight. This charity fund embezzlement is textbook wire fraud. And DeAndre's manipulation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act database using a federally insured bank network is a severe felony. They handed you the murder weapon with their fingerprints pressed deeply into the metal. So how do we hit them?" I asked, leaning forward. "Do we file a civil suit? Do we take this to the local press and expose the charity fund?" "Absolutely not," Donovan replied without missing a beat. "If you file a civil suit or go to the media, you give them a chance to destroy evidence. You give your father time to call in favors, spin the narrative, and hide the embezzled money. We do not do screaming matches here, Charmaine. We do not give warnings. We are going to build an inescapable legal trap, and we are going to spring it when they have absolutely no room to maneuver." Donovan pressed a button on his intercom. Within 60 seconds, 4 junior partners and 2 senior forensic accountants walked into the room. They looked like a tactical strike team armed with legal pads and calculators. Donovan rapidly briefed them on the situation. The war room instantly came alive. The strategy was brilliant in its cold, calculated cruelty. We were not going to fight my father in a courtroom. We were going to let the United States government do the heavy lifting. Donovan instructed his forensic accountants to begin quietly compiling the embezzlement files, formatting the data into a pristine, irrefutable whistleblower report. They mapped every stolen dollar from the moment it hit the community charity fund to the exact moment it was spent on Chloe's luxury salon and my father's political action committee. Once the dossier was perfect, Donovan would bypass the local authorities entirely. He had a direct line to a senior agent at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The IRS does not care about local city council politics. They only care about tax evasion and money laundering. By feeding them the perfectly packaged evidence of a multi-million-dollar federal grant fraud, we were effectively handing the federal government a guaranteed conviction on a silver platter. While the accountants tore into the financial records, Elias worked with Donovan's cyber team to package the background check hack. They prepared a separate, equally devastating file for the FBI Cybercrimes Division, detailing DeAndre's identity theft and unauthorized access to a protected federal database. I sat at the head of the massive table, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, watching the legal machinery churn. The contrast was staggering. Right at this very moment, my family honestly believed I was shivering in my rusted Honda Accord, breaking my teeth on stale crackers, and crying over my ruined life. They thought they had successfully locked me in an invisible cage. They had no idea that I was sitting in a multi-million-dollar legal war room commanding a team of elite federal sharks who were currently drawing up the blueprints for their total destruction. "We are going to time the strike perfectly," Donovan explained, pointing to a calendar projected on the wall. "The IRS and the FBI will need a few days to verify the data we hand them and secure the federal warrants from a judge. But once those warrants are signed, it is over. They freeze all assets. They seize the bank accounts. They kick in the doors." "How long?" I asked, my heart beating with a steady, fierce anticipation. Donovan looked at his watch. "Today is Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, the warrants will be active." I looked down at my hands. Friday. The timing was almost poetic. This weekend was my father's annual community gala. It was his biggest political event of the year, a massive, highly publicized charity dinner where he rubbed shoulders with the elite, collected campaign donations, and paraded his fake black excellence image for the local news cameras. He was planning to use the gala to officially launch DeAndre's political career. They were going to stand on a stage draped in stolen wealth and accept the applause of the very community they were secretly robbing blind. Evelyn, who had been sitting quietly in the corner observing the war room, caught my eye. She knew exactly what I was thinking. The gala. She murmured, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Yes," I replied, a matching smile forming on my lips. "The gala." Suddenly, my cheap prepaid burner phone vibrated against the polished mahogany table. The harsh buzzing sound cut through the low murmur of the accountants and lawyers working around me. I picked it up and looked at the cracked screen. It was a text message from Chloe. I opened the message. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of her words practically bled through the screen. "Dad says if you do not sign the deed by his community gala this weekend, he is having the cops impound your car," the text read. "He knows you are sleeping in it behind the old strip mall. The police chief owes him a favor. If your car gets impounded, you will be sleeping on the actual sidewalk. Stop being a loser, Charmaine. Bring the signed paperwork to the hotel ballroom on Saturday night. Use the service elevator so my guests do not have to look at you." I stared at the glowing text. She was threatening to take away my only shelter. They were so drunk on their own perceived power that they were casually coordinating the complete physical ruin of their own flesh and blood via text message. They wanted me to drag myself through the service entrance of a luxury hotel, broken and humiliated, to hand over an $8.5 million property so they could continue funding their criminal lifestyle. Donovan noticed the shift in my expression. He stopped talking to his junior partner and looked at me. "Is there a problem, Charmaine?" I set the phone down on the table. "No problem, Donovan. Just a change in venue for the final act. My father wants me to attend his community gala this weekend to sign over the commercial property. He threatened to have the police impound my car if I do not comply." Donovan raised an eyebrow, a predatory glint flashing in his eyes. "And what do you want to do?" "I want to give him exactly what he asked for," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. "I want the IRS and the FBI to execute those federal warrants on Saturday night. I do not want them to raid his house in the morning when no one is looking. I want the federal agents to walk right through the front doors of that luxury hotel ballroom. I want them to slap the handcuffs on my father and DeAndre in front of the press, the mayor, and every single wealthy donor they have ever lied to." Elias chuckled from his computer station. "A public execution. I like it." Donovan nodded slowly, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. "The FBI loves a high-profile arrest. It sends a message. If the evidence is as airtight as I know it is, coordinating the takedown for Saturday night will not be an issue. We will have the agents on standby." I looked back down at the burner phone. Chloe was probably sitting in a luxury spa right now, paid for by stolen charity funds, waiting for my desperate, panicked reply. She expected me to beg. She expected me to ask for mercy. I typed my response with steady, deliberate keystrokes. "I will be at the gala. Have the paperwork ready." I set the burner phone down on the polished mahogany table and looked up. The energy in the war room had shifted. One of Donovan's senior forensic accountants, a sharp-featured man named Bennett, walked back into the room holding a freshly printed stack of financial ledgers. He did not look at Donovan. He walked straight over to me and placed the documents right next to my encrypted laptop. "We followed the money from the charity fund," Charmaine Bennett said, tapping the top page with his pen. "But while we were tracking the outbound wire transfers, we stumbled onto something else. Something massive. Your father and your brother-in-law are completely broke." I frowned, leaning forward to look at the spreadsheets. "Broke? That makes no sense, Bennett. I saw the charity ledgers. They embezzled millions of dollars over the last 3 years. Where did all that cash go?" "It went to servicing their debt," Bennett explained, pulling up a secondary screen on the wall monitor. "Councilman Harrison and DeAndre live a lifestyle that costs 10 times what they actually earn. Your father's 6-bedroom estate in Fairfield, DeAndre's fleet of luxury cars, Chloe's endless business ventures. They burned through the stolen charity money just to keep up appearances. When the charity funds started drying up because of federal audits, they turned to private shadow lenders to maintain their black excellence facade." Bennett tapped the keyboard, bringing up 2 massive loan contracts. "Your father took out a $4 million hard money loan against his Fairfield estate. DeAndre took out a combined $400,000 in high-interest collateral loans for his vehicles and Chloe's spa build-out. These are not standard bank mortgages, Charmaine. These are predatory, short-term loans from a private equity firm in New York. The interest rates are astronomical." I stared at the staggering numbers on the screen. But private equity firms do not just hand out millions of dollars without rock-solid collateral. Neither of them have that kind of liquid capital. What did they use to secure the loans? Bennett smiled, a tight, humorless expression. "They used your property." A cold shock ran down my spine. "My grandfather's commercial lot." "Exactly," Donovan interjected, walking over to the table. "Harrison used his political clout as the chairman of the city planning board to convince the private lender that the commercial lot was a guaranteed future asset. He filed a pending transfer of deed agreement, essentially promising the lender that he would have the $8.5 million property in his possession before the balloon payments were due. He leveraged your inheritance to fund his fake empire. That is why they have been so desperate to break you. That is why they got you fired and made you homeless. It was not just greed, Charmaine. It was absolute panic. If they do not get that deed by this weekend, their entire financial house of cards collapses." I sat back in my leather chair, the sheer magnitude of their deception washing over me. They were not untouchable titans of the community. They were desperate drowning men treading water in a sea of toxic debt. They had destroyed my life because they were terrified of losing their own. "Private debt is a fascinating thing," Donovan continued, sitting down across from me. "It is a commodity. It can be bought, sold, and traded without the debtor's permission. The New York equity firm that holds their loans is currently classifying them as high risk. If an anonymous corporate entity were to approach that firm and offer to purchase the debt in full cash in hand, the firm would offload it in a heartbeat just to clear their books." I looked at Donovan, my mind instantly grasping the strategy. "Silas Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Donovan nodded slowly. "You have $12.4 million sitting in a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. You can buy the paper on your father's mansion. You can buy the notes on DeAndre's cars. The transition of ownership takes less than 24 hours. If you execute this purchase, Charmaine, you do not just expose their crimes. You literally become their bank. You own the roof over their heads. Do it, I said, my voice echoing with absolute certainty. Contact the firm right now. Buy every single ounce of debt tied to the Harrison family name. Use the blind trust. Leave no trace back to me. Donovan signaled his team and the war room exploded into action again. I watched as millions of dollars were silently moved across the globe. My grandfather's money, the wealth he had built through decades of honest, grueling labor, was now being weaponized to trap the parasites who had tried to steal it. The irony was exquisite. By mid-afternoon on Thursday, the wire transfers cleared. The legal titles and loan agreements were digitally transferred to Silas Vanguard Holdings, LLC. I sat alone in the conference room with Evelyn and Elias as the final confirmation emails rolled in. I pulled up the newly acquired loan portfolios on my encrypted laptop. I was looking at the intimate financial lifelines of the people who had mocked me, starved me, and tried to erase my existence. I now held the absolute legal right to seize their assets if they violated the terms of their agreements. Let us look at their payment history, Elias said, typing a command into the terminal to access the automated billing logs. Let us see how desperate they really are. The screen populated with a color-coded ledger. Row after row of red text filled the monitor. Elias whistled under his breath. They are not just struggling, Charmaine. They are drowning. DeAndre has missed 3 consecutive payments on the cars. He is in severe breach of contract. And your father. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing my finger over the final column next to my father's name. Harrison had missed his last 2 massive balloon payments on the Fairfield estate. They are in default, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical shockwave. Right now. Today. They are legally in default. The only reason the New York firm had not foreclosed on them yet was because my father kept promising them he would have the commercial lot signed over by the gala this weekend. Bennett walked back into the room holding a sleek black leather folder. He placed it carefully on the table in front of me. He opened it, revealing 2 crisp, legally binding documents. They were printed on thick official watermark paper. These are notices of default and foreclosures, Bennett said quietly. Because Silas Vanguard Holdings now owns the debt, you have the right to execute these immediately. There is no grace period left. There are no extensions. The second you sign these papers, the Fairfield estate and the luxury vehicles become the legal property of your LLC. Councilman Harrison and DeAndre will have 0 equity, 0 ownership, and absolutely 0 legal right to be on the premises. I picked up the expensive silver pen resting next to the folder. I thought about the bitter cold of my Honda Accord. I thought about the $50 bill my father had dropped on the marble floor of that exact estate, telling me to go buy a hot meal while he dined on roasted lamb paid for by stolen charity money. I thought about Chloe showing off her $15,000 diamond bracelet while she texted me threats about having my car impounded. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line on the first document. The ink flowed smoothly across the page as I signed my name on behalf of the LLC. I moved to the second document and signed it with the same steady hand. When do you want to execute the notices? Bennett asked, carefully sliding the folder back toward his chest. We can have local sheriffs serve them tomorrow morning. No, I replied, locking eyes with Donovan, who was standing by the door. Do not serve them tomorrow. File the paperwork with the county clerk's office electronically, but delay the physical execution until Saturday morning. I want the foreclosure to become legally binding at exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. Donovan smiled, a genuine expression of predatory respect. The day of the gala. Exactly, I said, standing up from my chair and smoothing the front of my jacket. I want my father to spend all day Saturday decorating that ballroom, making his political speeches, and bragging to the press about his empire. I want him to stand on that stage believing he has won. But legally, from 9 o'clock in the morning onward, he will be completely homeless. By the time I walk into that gala on Saturday night, I will not just be bringing the FBI. I will be walking in as the legal owner of his entire life. The legal trap was fully armed. There was no way out. No political favor could save them. No amount of screaming or manipulation could reverse a federal foreclosure held by an anonymous trust. My father had spent my entire life controlling the board, moving me around like a worthless pawn, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. Checkmate, Elias murmured, shutting his laptop. I looked out the massive glass windows of the Washington, D.C. office, watching the city lights flicker to life in the fading dusk. I was flying back to Connecticut tomorrow. I was going to walk right into the lion's den wearing a custom suit carrying the heavy steel lockbox my grandfather left me. The invisible cage they had locked me in was shattered. The silent takeover was complete. The only thing left to do was let the guillotine drop. I flew back to Connecticut on Friday night, traveling under the protective veil of my new corporate identity. I did not return to the freezing streets or the dark parking lots. Instead, Silas Vanguard Holdings had secured a private gated estate on the edge of town, complete with a sprawling driveway and impenetrable security. I woke up on Saturday morning and watched the digital clock on the bedside table change from 8:59 to exactly 9 o'clock. At that precise second, the electronic filings at the county clerk's office were finalized. The foreclosure became legally binding. My father Harrison and my brother-in-law DeAndre were officially entirely stripped of their primary assets. The sprawling six-bedroom mansion in Fairfield and the fleet of luxury vehicles no longer belonged to them. They belonged to me. A profound, terrifying calm settled over my chest. The chaotic desperation of the last 7 months evaporated, leaving behind a sharp clinical focus. Today was the day the empire of lies burned to the ground. My first appointment of the day was not with a lawyer or a federal agent. It was with a master tailor who had been flown in from Manhattan specifically for this occasion. For 7 months, my family had defined me by my stained coat, my worn-out sneakers, and my hollowed-out face. They thought my poverty was a permanent stain on my character. I needed an armor that would visually shatter their delusions the moment I stepped into the room. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors in the master bedroom as the tailor made the final adjustments. I was not wearing a standard evening gown or a modest cocktail dress. I was wearing a bespoke, custom-tailored power suit. The fabric was a deep midnight blue wool-silk blend that caught the light with a subtle, commanding authority. The lapels were razor-sharp. The cut was aggressive and immaculate, draping perfectly over my frame, which had slowly started to regain its strength. I paired it with a crisp white silk shirt and black leather stilettos. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style that left my face completely exposed. I looked in the mirror and did not recognize the broken woman who had wept in a frozen Honda Accord. I saw the CEO of a multi-million-dollar trust. I saw my grandfather's wrath made flesh. Before heading to the city center where the trap was waiting, I had one final, deeply personal stop to make. I put on a heavy wool overcoat, walked out to the driveway, and climbed into the back of a waiting black SUV. I instructed the driver to take me to the Oakwood Memorial Cemetery. The winter storm from a few days ago had passed, leaving the cemetery covered in a pristine, blindingly white layer of snow. The afternoon air was crisp and completely still. I walked alone down the winding stone pathways, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots, until I reached the familiar marble headstone sitting beneath a massive ancient oak tree, Silas Vanguard. I stood in front of my grandfather's grave, the biting cold stinging my cheeks. I reached out and brushed a layer of snow off the top of the marble, tracing the engraved letters of his name with my gloved fingertips. "I am doing it, Granddad," I whispered into the quiet, freezing air. "I am finally doing exactly what you prepared me for." I thought about the journal he had left in the steel lockbox. I thought about the decades of quiet, relentless work he had put into building his real estate portfolio, securing a future for a family that ultimately proved themselves unworthy of his sacrifice. Harrison had taken that legacy and twisted it into a vanity project, a slush fund to buy political influence and diamond bracelets. He had used my grandfather's wealth to build a fortress of corruption, and then he had used that very same power to throw me out into the cold. They thought they were untouchable. I continued, my voice steady, carrying over the silent rows of headstones. They thought they could steal your land and bury me to cover their tracks. But you saw them. You saw the rot inside of them before the cancer even took you. I just wanted to come here and tell you that it ends tonight. The charity fraud, the stolen grants, the fake background checks. I am tearing all of it down. I am taking the land back and I am cleansing the family name. I stood there for a long time, letting the profound silence of the cemetery anchor me. I did not feel any guilt. I did not feel any residual obligation to the people who shared my blood. My father and my sister had violently severed those ties the night they left me to freeze. Silas was my only true family, and tonight I was acting as his executioner. I turned away from the grave and walked back to the SUV. As I climbed into the leather back seat, my encrypted phone buzzed. It was a secure text message from Evelyn. I directed the driver to a private underground parking garage situated just 3 blocks away from the luxury hotel where my father's community gala was being held. When we pulled in, a sleek, armored command vehicle was parked in the far corner. Evelyn and Elias were waiting outside the heavy metal doors. I stepped out of the SUV, the heels of my stilettos echoing sharply against the concrete floor. Evelyn looked me up and down, taking in the midnight blue bespoke suit and the cold, unyielding expression on my face. She gave a single approving nod. "You look like a nightmare, Charmaine," Evelyn said, a fierce, predatory smile touching her lips. "Are we ready?" I asked, walking over to the command vehicle. Elias slid open the side door, revealing a bank of glowing monitors and communication equipment. He handed me a secure earpiece. "We are locked and loaded." Donovan worked his magic in Washington. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI Cybercrimes Unit moved at lightning speed. The federal judge reviewed the whistleblower report and signed the warrants an hour ago. Evelyn stepped closer, crossing her arms over her signature blue coat. "We have 2 teams of federal agents sitting in unmarked vans in the alleyway behind the hotel. They have the floor plans. They have the arrest warrants for Harrison and DeAndre. They are just waiting for our signal to breach the ballroom doors." The magnitude of the moment settled over me. This was no longer a theoretical legal strategy discussed in a pristine boardroom. The federal government was literally idling in the alleyway, ready to drag my father and my brother-in-law out in handcuffs. Just then, the cheap prepaid burner phone in my overcoat pocket began to vibrate. I pulled it out. The caller ID flashed with DeAndre's name. I held the phone up so Evelyn and Elias could see it. We all exchanged a look of pure, concentrated anticipation. I pressed the accept button and put the phone on speaker, holding it between us in the quiet underground garage. Charmaine DeAndre's voice echoed from the tiny speaker. He sounded incredibly smug, his words slightly slurred from what was likely expensive pre-gala champagne. "I hope you are awake and not frozen to the steering wheel of that piece of junk car." I did not answer. I just let him talk, recording every single syllable of his unearned arrogance in my memory. "Tonight is a very big night for us." DeAndre continued, the background noise of clinking glasses and string quartet music filtering through the line. "Your father is officially announcing my candidacy for the city council seat he is vacating. We have the mayor here. We have the press. It is the beginning of my political career, the beginning of a new legacy. So I am calling to give you some very specific instructions about your little delivery tonight." He paused, letting out a condescending sigh. "When you bring the signed deed for the commercial lot, you are not to come through the main lobby. You are filthy, you are homeless, and you are a convicted felon. You are an absolute embarrassment to the black excellence this family represents. Go around to the loading dock in the back. Tell the kitchen staff you are making a delivery, and take the service elevator up to the VIP holding room behind the main stage. Drop the paperwork on the table and leave immediately. If I see your face anywhere near the cameras, I swear to God I will log back into that database and make sure you cannot even get a job scrubbing toilets. Do you understand me?" The sheer audacity of his threat hung in the air. He was literally confessing to his federal crime again, bragging about his ability to ruin my life while actively preparing to launch a political career built on stolen charity money. "I will be there, DeAndre," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "And I promise you tonight will be a night the press will never forget." I ended the call before he could say another word. I dropped the cheap burner phone onto the concrete floor of the garage and crushed it under the heel of my stiletto. The plastic shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. I did not need it anymore. I did not need to hide in the shadows, and I certainly was not going to use the service elevator. Evelyn looked at the shattered phone, then up at me. It is time. A massive pitch-black chauffeured Maybach pulled quietly into the garage, its headlights cutting through the dim lighting. The driver stepped out and opened the heavy rear door for me. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white silk shirt and buttoned my midnight blue jacket. I felt the comforting weight of the steel lockbox key resting in my pocket. Every moment of starvation, every freezing night in the car, every single insult and threat had culminated in this exact second. My father and DeAndre had built a fragile, glittering empire of glass, and I was arriving with the sledgehammer. I stepped into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. The doors closed with a solid, definitive thud. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful purr that vibrated through the floorboards. "Let us go," I told the driver, my eyes fixed on the exit of the garage. The Maybach glided forward, heading straight for the glittering lights of the luxury hotel. The wait was over. The trap was armed. The hunt had officially begun. The Maybach pulled up to the grand front entrance of the Grand Sterling Hotel, its sleek black chassis reflecting the flashing lights of the hired paparazzi. The valet attendants, accustomed to seeing luxury vehicles, practically scrambled over each other to open the heavy rear door. I stepped out onto the plush red carpet, the crisp evening air biting at my face. I did not look like a woman who had spent the last 7 months freezing in a rusted car. The midnight blue bespoke suit fit me like modern armor. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute authority. I ignored the flash of the cameras and walked confidently up the marble steps toward the main double doors. DeAndre had explicitly commanded me to use the loading dock and the service elevator. He wanted me to slink into the building like a shameful secret, leaving my dignity next to the dumpsters. Instead, I walked right past the towering security guards at the front entrance. They did not even ask for my invitation. My demeanor, combined with the sheer quality of my tailored clothing, projected an aura of wealth that bypassed security checkpoints without a single word. I stepped into the grand ballroom, and the sheer scale of the hypocrisy nearly took my breath away. The room was a masterclass in stolen opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over hundreds of the city's most influential residents. There were towering ice sculptures, waiters carrying silver trays of expensive champagne, and a live jazz band playing softly in the corner. This entire spectacle, the flowers, the caviar, the rented lighting, was paid for by the federal grant money my father had siphoned away from the community. I stood near the entrance, remaining in the shadows of a massive floral arrangement, and surveyed the battlefield. My sister Chloe was working the left side of the room. She was wearing a custom silk gown that undoubtedly cost more than the average person's yearly salary. The $15,000 diamond tennis bracelet sparkled aggressively on her wrist as she laughed, sipping champagne and schmoozing with the wives of local real estate developers. DeAndre was on the right side of the room, looking incredibly smug in a tailored velvet tuxedo. He was shaking hands with the chief of police and several prominent judges, playing the role of the humble, dedicated public servant, ready to take over my father's city council seat. But it was my father who commanded the center of attention. Harrison stood on a raised stage at the far end of the ballroom, illuminated by a brilliant spotlight. He was standing behind a clear acrylic podium, speaking into a high-end microphone, his voice booming effortlessly across the massive room. "We built this community on the foundation of trust, of shared sacrifice, and above all else of family," Harrison declared, placing a hand over his heart. He paused, letting the crowd murmur their approval. Black excellence is not just a catchphrase for the Harrison family. It is not just a hashtag. It is a daily, unwavering commitment to uplifting those who cannot lift themselves. We are here tonight to raise funds for the next generation, to ensure that no child in our district is left behind and no family is left out in the cold. The sheer audacity of his words made my blood run entirely cold. He was giving a passionate speech about protecting families from the cold, while fully believing his own daughter was currently freezing to death in a parking lot just a few miles away. He was asking these wealthy donors to write massive checks to a charity fund that he and DeAndre had systematically drained to zero. "It is time for new leadership," Harrison continued, his voice rising to a dramatic crescendo. "It is time to pass the torch to a man who embodies the integrity and the moral fortitude this city desperately needs. My son-in-law, DeAndre." The ballroom erupted into applause. People set down their champagne glasses and clapped enthusiastically. DeAndre stepped forward, waving humbly to the crowd, basking in the stolen adoration. Chloe rushed over to his side, throwing her arms around him, the picture-perfect political wife. It was the perfect moment, the peak of their glittering, fraudulent facade. I stepped out from the shadows of the floral arrangement and walked directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, the sharp heels of my leather stilettos clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The midnight blue wool silk blend of my suit caught the light of the chandeliers, commanding immediate attention. A woman standing near the aisle turned to look at me, her polite applause slowing to a halt. Then the man next to her turned. Within seconds, a ripple of confusion and shock began to spread through the crowd. The people closest to me recognized my face. They knew me as Councilman Harrison's disgraced felon daughter. They had heard the whispers Chloe had planted about my supposed drug addiction, my mental breakdown, and my homelessness. They expected to see a broken vagrant. Instead, they saw a predator walking calmly into their midst. The applause began to falter, dying out in uneven patches across the massive room. The jazz band, sensing the sudden shift in the energy, awkwardly stopped playing mid-measure. A thick, heavy silence descended over the grand ballroom. On the stage, Harrison noticed the crowd looking away from him. He followed their gaze down the center aisle. When his eyes locked onto mine, he stopped speaking entirely. His mouth hung open by a fraction of an inch. His hand gripped the edges of the acrylic podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. DeAndre, who had been waving to the cameras, slowly lowered his hand. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. Chloe actually dropped her champagne glass. The crystal shattered sharply against the floor, the sound ringing out like a gunshot in the silent room. I did not stop walking until I was standing 20 feet away from the edge of the stage. I looked up at my father, my expression completely void of any emotion. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I just stood there, existing as undeniable proof that he had failed to break me. Harrison was a seasoned politician. He realized instantly that staring at me in silent horror was giving the press exactly what they wanted. He forced a wide, incredibly fake smile onto his face and leaned back into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a surprise guest," Harrison announced, his voice tight and strained. "My eldest daughter, Charmaine, has decided to join us. Please, enjoy the catering while I go greet her." He practically sprinted off the side of the stage. DeAndre and Chloe were right behind him. The three of them descended upon me like a pack of rabid wolves trying to maintain a civilized formation. They flanked me immediately, blocking me from the view of the nearest cameras. Harrison grabbed my left arm. His grip was vicious, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep through the thick fabric of my suit. DeAndre grabbed my right arm. "Keep smiling," Harrison hissed through his teeth, nodding politely to a confused donor standing nearby. "Walk, right now." They did not give me a choice. They physically forced me forward, dragging me out of the main ballroom and down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with plush red velvet wallpaper. Chloe walked quickly ahead of us, her heels clicking frantically as she pushed open the heavy mahogany door to the private VIP holding room. They shoved me inside. Harrison followed closely behind, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and locking the deadbolt with a loud click. The thick walls instantly muted the low murmur of the ballroom outside. The masks dropped immediately. The polite political smiles vanished, replaced by faces twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. "What is wrong with you?" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the walls. She pointed a trembling finger at my clothes. "Where did you get that suit? Did you steal it?" You are going to get arrested right here and ruin DeAndre's big night. DeAndre stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. I explicitly told you to use the service elevator, you stupid brat. Do you have any idea how many reporters are out there? If they run a background check on you and see that felony on your record, it links directly back to us. You are a walking liability. I calmly brushed the wrinkles out of my sleeves where they had grabbed me. I did not say a word. I just looked at them, observing their sheer panic. They were sweating. Their breathing was ragged. They were acting exactly like criminals who knew their time was running out. Harrison marched over to a glass coffee table in the center of the room. He picked up a thick, leather-bound folder and forcefully threw it back down. The heavy thud rattled the glass. He opened the folder, revealing the legal deed to the commercial lot and a silver pen. He turned to face me, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a dark, tyrannical fury. He was no longer the polished community leader. He was the monster who had thrown his own child out into a blizzard. Sign it right now, you ungrateful mistake, or I will have security break your jaw and throw you in an alley. I did not flinch. The venom in my father's voice, a sound that had once possessed the power to reduce me to a trembling, obedient child, now washed over me like a completely harmless breeze. The threat of physical violence, the threat of being thrown into an alleyway, meant absolutely nothing to a woman who had already survived the absolute worst they had to offer. I looked down at the heavy glass coffee table. The legal deed to my grandfather's commercial lot sat there crisp and white right next to the expensive silver pen. I slowly reached out and picked up the pen. Harrison exhaled heavily, a smug, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He actually believed he had won. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored jacket, his chest puffing out with arrogant pride, fully convinced that the sheer force of his intimidation had broken my spirit one final time. Chloe crossed her arms over her custom silk gown, rolling her eyes and letting out a loud, theatrical sigh as if my ultimate submission was simply an exhausting inevitability she had been forced to wait for. I did not uncap the pen. I did not look down at the signature line on the deed. Instead, I turned the cold silver pen over in my fingers, feeling its weight, and then I shifted my gaze away from my father. I looked directly into DeAndre's eyes. I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the cold, terrifying smile of an executioner who had just locked the guillotine into place. I did not come here to sign away an $8.5 million property. DeAndre, I said, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating tension of the VIP room with absolute razor-sharp clarity. But I am intensely curious about one thing. I am curious how your bank's Human Resources Department is going to explain your federal indictment to their shareholders. The smug expression vanished from DeAndre's face so fast it was almost comical. His brow furrowed in deep confusion, his brain struggling to process the words I had just spoken. Federal indictment. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and lethal. I reached inside the inner pocket of my midnight blue bespoke suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, neatly bound dossier prepared by Donovan's elite cyber team. I held it up for a fraction of a second so they could all see the official Washington, D.C. legal letterhead, and then I dropped it onto the glass table right on top of the blank property deed. This is a complete digital forensic report, I explained smoothly, watching DeAndre's eyes dart frantically toward the folder. It contains the exact internal IP address, the media access control address, and the executive security token you used at 8:15 in the morning on a Tuesday to manually override the Fair Credit Reporting Act database. It proves unequivocally that you used a federally insured banking network to commit identity theft and wire fraud just to falsify my background check. DeAndre stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant, untouchable posture he had carried into the room evaporated instantly. His skin turned a sickly, ashen gray, all the blood draining from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to spin one of his usual manipulative lies, but absolutely no words came out. He just stared at the dossier on the glass table as if it were a live, ticking explosive. He knew exactly what that data meant. He knew he left a digital trail, and he knew his career, his freedom, and his life were completely over. Chloe, entirely oblivious to the technical magnitude of the evidence I had just presented, stepped forward and slapped her hand against the glass table. "You are bluffing!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing harshly off the velvet walls. "You do not have the money to hire a cyber investigator. You are living in a freezing car. You are making this up to ruin DeAndre's big night because you are a jealous, pathetic failure. You are just trying to scare us." I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I did not need to. I simply reached into my jacket a second time. I pulled out a larger, heavier folder, the IRS audit files. I dropped it onto the table right next to the cyber report. The heavy thud made Chloe physically flinch. "I am not jealous, Chloe," I replied, my tone icy, unwavering, and utterly devoid of pity. "I am just auditing the family business." This second folder contains the heavily redacted tax documents from Grandad Silas Cross, referenced with the last 3 years of outbound wire transfers from the Community Charity Fund. I turned my attention back to my father. Harrison was no longer smirking. His face was completely rigid, the muscles in his jaw ticking frantically. His eyes were locked onto the thick stack of financial documents, recognizing the names of his shell corporations printed clearly on the exposed top page. "It shows exactly how you and DeAndre have been systematically embezzling federal grants meant for underprivileged families," I said, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum devastating impact. "It shows the $50,000 you wired to the luxury car dealership. It shows the $100,000 you funneled into Chloe's spa build-out. It shows every single dirty dime you funneled into your political action committee to buy your fake community influence." Chloe looked at her father, then at her husband. She was spoiled and she was wildly entitled, but she was not entirely stupid. She saw the absolute paralyzing terror mirrored in both of their eyes. She realized in that exact moment that I was not bluffing. The $15,000 diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist suddenly looked very heavy, a glittering chain of stolen money that was about to drag her down to the bottom of the ocean. She opened her mouth to scream again, but a choked, terrified sob came out instead. She backed away from the table, pressing herself against the wall. I took a deliberate step closer to my father. He instinctively took a half step back, his towering physical presence shrinking under the weight of his exposed crimes. "You spent the last 7 months telling every potential employer in this state that I was a criminal," I said, my voice echoing with a righteous, undeniable authority. "You used your political connections to have me evicted from my apartment. You tried to freeze me to death in a rusted car to steal an $8 million transit hub. You demanded that I apologize to you while you actively destroyed my life. But the real criminals have been standing on that stage tonight wearing velvet tuxedos and custom silk gowns, stealing from our own people." Harrison was a cornered animal. His political survival instincts kicked in, desperate to regain control of a narrative that had completely and irreversibly slipped through his fingers. He refused to accept that the daughter he viewed as a worthless pawn had just dismantled his entire empire. He let out a loud, forced laugh. It was a nervous, jagged, terrifying sound that did not reach his eyes. His hands were shaking visibly as he pointed at the folders on the table. "You think anyone is going to believe this garbage?" Harrison spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw panic and residual megalomania. "You are a homeless felon, Charmaine. I am a city councilman. I am a pillar of this community. I have the chief of police eating out of my hand. I have municipal judges on my speed dial. You think you can just walk in here with some printed spreadsheets and take me down? I will have these documents shredded, and I will have you locked in a psychiatric ward before midnight. Nobody is going to believe you over me." He took a deep breath, trying to inflate his chest, trying to summon the imposing patriarch he had played for decades. He looked at DeAndre, demanding backup, but DeAndre was still staring blankly at the table, completely broken. "You have nothing," Harrison hissed, stepping toward me with his fists clenched. "You are nothing." I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of peace. He still did not understand the game. He still thought we were playing by local rules, where his corrupt friendships could save him. "I do not need them to believe me, Dad," I said softly. "I just needed them to review the evidence." Harrison opened his mouth to yell another empty threat, but the words never left his throat. Just then, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP room were violently kicked open. The doors splintered. The sound was deafening, a brutal crack of wood giving way to absolute force. The heavy mahogany doors slammed backward against the velvet walls, the brass handles gouging deep into the expensive wallpaper. 6 federal agents flooded into the VIP holding room. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, a tactical wave of dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests and backs. The sudden influx of armed, heavily armored law enforcement completely shattered the suffocating aristocratic tension my family had tried to maintain. I calmly took 2 steps backward, putting distance between myself and the glass coffee table. I smoothed the lapels of my midnight blue bespoke suit. The federal agents bypassed me entirely. They did not even glance in my direction. They had their targets and they executed their orders with clinical efficiency. 2 heavily built agents zeroed in on DeAndre, the arrogant vice president of human resources, the man who had sat in his plush office and destroyed my career with a single keystroke, froze. His eyes widened in absolute primal terror. He raised his hands, stammering out a pathetic broken string of syllables, desperately trying to construct a corporate lie. The agents did not give him the chance to speak. One agent grabbed the collar of DeAndre's custom velvet tuxedo, spinning him around with dizzying speed. The second agent slammed him face first into the velvet wall. The impact knocked the wind out of DeAndre's lungs with a loud, sickening grunt. Before he could even register the physical pain, his arms were forcefully wrenched behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of cold steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the room. "You have the right to remain silent," the arresting agent barked, his voice flat and devoid of any human sympathy. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." DeAndre pressed his cheek against the wallpaper, his chest heaving, his tailored suit jacket violently bunched up around his shoulders. He was weeping. Actual, genuine tears streamed down his face as the sheer reality of a 15-year federal sentence crushed his spirit. Chloe completely lost her mind. The sight of her husband, the source of her stolen wealth and unearned arrogance, being treated like a violent street criminal, shattered her fragile reality. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that tore through the air. She lunged forward, her custom silk gown tangling around her legs, raising her manicured hands to claw at the agent securing DeAndre's handcuffs. "Get your hands off him!" Chloe shrieked, her face contorted in an ugly, desperate mask of rage. "Do you know who we are? You cannot do this. We are the Harrisons. Let him go right now." A female federal agent intercepted Chloe instantly. She caught Chloe's wrists mid-air, twisting them downward with a practiced, effortless maneuver that forced my sister to her knees. "Ma'am, step back immediately, or you will be placed under arrest for assaulting a federal officer," the female agent commanded, her tone dropping to a lethal warning. Chloe collapsed onto the carpet, the $15,000 diamond tennis bracelet scraping harshly against the floor. She buried her face in her hands, wailing uncontrollably, the picture-perfect political wife reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess. Harrison, however, did not weep. His survival instinct was purely political. He had spent decades bullying his way out of consequences, using his status as a shield against accountability. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest to project the towering, authoritative aura of the untouchable city councilman. He took a bold step toward the lead FBI agent, his face flushing with indignant fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison boomed, projecting his voice exactly as he did on the campaign trail. "I demand your badge numbers, all of them. I am Councilman Harrison. I am a personal friend of the mayor. The chief of police was just out there drinking my champagne. You have no jurisdiction to kick down my doors and assault my son-in-law. I will have every single one of your pensions stripped by Monday morning." The lead FBI agent, a tall man with silver hair and a completely unbothered expression, stopped directly in front of my father. He did not look intimidated. He looked at Harrison the way a person looks at a piece of dirt on their shoe. "The local police chief has zero jurisdiction over a federal grand jury indictment," Councilman, the lead agent, stated calmly. He reached inside his windbreaker and pulled out a thick, legally bound document folded perfectly in half. He shoved the document hard against Harrison's chest, forcing my father to instinctively grab it to keep it from falling. "That is a federal arrest warrant," the agent continued, his voice projecting loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzling federal grant funds. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Harrison's imposing posture vanished in an instant. He looked down at the warrant in his hands. He saw the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. He saw the list of his shell companies. He saw the exact dollar amounts he had stolen from the community charity fund. The political armor he had worn his entire life dissolved into absolute dust. His hands began to shake violently. "No," Harrison whispered, his voice cracking, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a secret exit. "No, this is a mistake. I am a pillar of this community. I am a leader." "Turn around, Councilman," the agent repeated, stepping forward and physically grabbing Harrison's shoulder. My father offered no resistance. The fight completely drained out of him. He was spun around and a second pair of steel handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists. The great Councilman Harrison, the man who had thrown me out into a blizzard and demanded I apologize for my own abuse, was now firmly secured in federal custody. I stood silently by the glass coffee table watching the empire fall. I did not gloat, I did not sneer, I simply witnessed the absolute execution of justice. "Let us move," the lead agent ordered. They did not lead my father and DeAndre out through the service elevator. They did not afford them the quiet dignity of slipping out the back door away from the cameras. The federal government wanted to send a very clear, very public message about political corruption. The agents grabbed Harrison and DeAndre by the arms and marched them forcefully out of the VIP holding room. I followed a few paces behind, walking past my sister Chloe, who was still curled up on the floor, weeping into the carpet. We emerged from the velvet hallway and stepped right back out into the grand ballroom. The scene was absolutely apocalyptic. Word of the breach had already spread through the crowd. The jazz band was completely silent. The waiters had stopped pouring champagne. Hundreds of the city's most elite wealthy citizens stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with shock and horror. And then the press realized what was happening. The local news cameras, which had been hired by Harrison to broadcast DeAndre's glorious political launch, immediately swiveled toward the hallway. Flashbulbs erupted like a violent lightning storm. The blinding white light illuminated my father and my brother-in-law as they were paraded through the center aisle. "Councilman Harrison, what are the charges?" a reporter screamed, shoving a microphone past a frozen security guard. "Is it true you stole from the charity fund?" DeAndre, another journalist, yelled, the shutter of his camera clicking frantically. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. The people who had been clapping for them just 10 minutes ago now scrambled backward, desperate to avoid being photographed anywhere near the disgraced politicians. The murmurs of admiration were entirely replaced by gasps of disgust and furious whispers. The facade of black excellence my father had weaponized for decades was publicly, brutally butchered in front of his entire congregation of donors. DeAndre kept his head down, hiding his face from the blinding camera flashes, his velvet tuxedo wrinkling awkwardly around his handcuffed wrists. But Harrison kept his head up. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic, his eyes wide and frantic as he realized his reputation was completely permanently annihilated. The agents marched them steadily toward the grand double doors of the hotel lobby. The flashing lights followed them every step of the way. I walked behind the procession completely untouched, entirely serene. The midnight blue fabric of my suit absorbed the flashing lights. I was the architect of their destruction, walking calmly in the wake of the storm I had unleashed. We reached the massive marble lobby. The glass doors leading out to the street were just a few yards away, where a convoy of black federal vehicles was waiting, with their red and blue lights spinning aggressively against the night sky. Suddenly, Harrison dug his heels into the polished marble floor. He stopped walking, forcing the agents to physically jerk him forward. He twisted his body around, ignoring the federal officers, and locked his wild, bloodshot eyes directly onto me. He was terrified, but his toxic ego refused to accept total defeat. He still believed he had a trump card. He still believed his money could buy his way out of the consequences. "You think this is over?" Charmaine Harrison screamed, his voice echoing violently off the high marble ceilings of the lobby. Everyone stopped. The reporters held their breath, their cameras still rolling, capturing every desperate syllable of his public meltdown. "I will call my lawyers tonight," Harrison bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "I have millions of dollars in equity. I will use the Fairfield estate to post my bail. I will be out of federal custody by tomorrow morning. And when I get out, I will destroy you. Do you hear me? I will crush you." He was practically foaming at the mouth, clinging to the only asset he thought he still possessed. His six-bedroom mansion, his fortress of power. The federal agents yanked hard on his arms, preparing to drag him through the glass doors. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand lobby, the cameras capturing my absolute terrifying calm. I reached into the breast pocket of my custom suit jacket. My fingers brushed past the heavy steel lockbox key and grasped the final piece of paper Donovan's legal team had prepared for me. I pulled the document out. It was printed on crisp, thick watermark paper, bearing the official seal of the county clerk's office. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and my father. Harrison stopped struggling. He stared at the piece of paper in my hand, his chest heaving, his furious expression faltering, as a new profound sense of dread washed over him. I held the document up so he could see the bold black lettering at the top of the page. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice steady, carrying over the silent lobby and straight into the microphones of the press. "You cannot use the house for bail, Dad, because as of 9 o'clock this morning, the private equity firm in New York sold your debt to an anonymous corporate trust. That trust belongs to me. I own the Fairfield estate. I own DeAndre's luxury vehicles. You have no equity. You have no leverage. And as of this exact moment, you are legally trespassing on my property." The silence that followed was absolute. The reporters stopped shouting. The camera flashes paused for a fraction of a second. Harrison stared at the notice of foreclosure in my hand. His eyes scanned the crisp black text darting desperately across the page, looking for a loophole, a mistake, a reason to laugh it off. But the county seal was undeniable. The signature was legally binding. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The arrogant, untouchable city councilman literally folded in on himself. His knees buckled, sending him crashing onto the polished marble floor of the hotel lobby. He did not yell. He did not issue any more empty threats. He just stared blankly at the marble tiles, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths. The empire of lies he had spent a lifetime building had completely evaporated in the span of 15 minutes. The lead FBI agent did not offer a single ounce of pity. He hauled my father back to his feet by the chains of his handcuffs. DeAndre was already weeping silently near the glass doors, too terrified to even look in my direction. The agents pushed them through the exit, marching them down the front steps and shoving them into the back of the waiting armored vehicles. I stood in the center of the lobby and watched the heavy metal doors of the van slam shut. The sirens wailed, a piercing, triumphant sound that echoed off the skyscrapers of the city. The blinding red and blue lights spun wildly, painting the faces of the stunned paparazzi as the federal convoy pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the night. The reporters immediately turned their microphones toward me, shouting questions, desperate for an exclusive quote from the daughter who had just orchestrated the greatest political takedown in the history of the city. I did not give them one. I simply turned around, walked past the stunned security guards, and exited through a side door into the crisp, quiet night air. My chauffeured Maybach was waiting. I climbed inside, sank into the plush leather seat, and took my first truly deep breath in 7 months. The heavy, invisible cage was gone. I was finally free. 3 months later, the dust had completely settled, leaving a radically different landscape in its wake. The federal prosecutors moved with ruthless efficiency. DeAndre, terrified of serving decades in a maximum security prison, tried to turn state's evidence against my father. But his cooperation meant very little when the digital forensics were already airtight. He was officially stripped of his banking credentials, publicly disgraced, and is currently facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison for identity theft and wire fraud. His plush corner office was cleared out in a single afternoon, My father did not fare any better. Without the Fairfield estate to use as collateral and with his bank accounts frozen by the IRS, Harrison was denied bail. The great city councilman, the man who used to demand immediate obedience from everyone around him, is now sitting in a cramped 6 by 8 foot concrete cell at a federal holding facility awaiting a highly publicized trial. His political allies abandoned him overnight. His name was erased from every community board and charity organization in the state. He is looking at 20 years for embezzling federal grants. And then there is Chloe. With her husband incarcerated and her father ruined, her endless stream of stolen wealth dried up instantly. The luxury spa she was building was seized by the bank. I legally repossessed the cars she and DeAndre drove, and I immediately evicted her from the Fairfield estate. I sold the mansion to a wonderful family with 3 dogs and donated the proceeds to a legitimate housing charity. Chloe, the golden child who once flaunted a $15,000 diamond bracelet and laughed at my homelessness, is now living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. She takes the public bus every morning to her new job, folding clothes at a minimum wage retail store in the local mall. I hear she is exhausted, but honest work is exactly what our grandfather would have wanted for her. As for me, I did not return to the corporate tech world. I had a much bigger legacy to manage. I officially took over Silas Vanguard Holdings, stepping into the role my grandfather always knew I was meant for. I took the $8.5 million commercial lot that sat at the center of the new transit hub, and instead of selling it to a massive soulless corporation, I partnered directly with the city. We are currently breaking ground on a massive state-of-the-art affordable housing complex and a legitimate community outreach center. It will bear my grandfather's name. It will actually help the families my father pretended to care about. Every morning I walk into my corner office, look out over the city skyline and smile. I am healthy, I am thriving, and I am surrounded by a team of people who respect my vision. My family thought they could bury me because I was quiet. They thought my refusal to scream and throw tantrums was a sign of weakness. They assumed they could strip away my job, my home, and my dignity, and I would simply fade away into the cold winter night. But they forgot one very crucial, unbreakable truth. They forgot that seeds grow in the dark. Have you ever had to use the law to teach toxic family a lesson? Let me know in the comments below. Hit subscribe, and remember, never let anyone else hold the pen to your story.